Welcome back to Sustainability Matters. I'm your host, Tria Case. Today, we're exploring the intricate web of our food ecosystem. The food ecosystem is not just about what we choose to put on our plates. It's a complex interplay of environmental, social, and economic factors. From farm to fork, every step along the way presents both possibilities and pitfalls for sustainability. Joining us are experts who will help us understand the dynamics of agriculture, supply chains, and consumption trends, and the pathways to a more sustainable future. Before we talk with our guests, let's first turn to Andrew Falzone for a broader perspective on the topic.
You've probably heard the expression, you are what you eat, and while you probably know that what you eat has a direct impact on your health, you might not be aware of the impact that your dietary choices have on the environment. In fact, our daily diet is caught up in a vicious cycle where our food choices contribute to climate change, and then the effects of climate change endanger the stability of our food systems. It all begins with what we eat. According to the United Nations, nearly 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions come from growing our food. That's more than the entire global aviation industry. Adding to that problem is that, according to the World Resource Institute, nearly 1/3 of the food we produce ends up as waste, and that waste creates more greenhouse gas emissions. But all foods don't contribute equally to the greenhouse gas emission problem. Some foods that we eat contribute substantially more than others. Let's start with this chart from the United Nations, which looks at kilograms of greenhouse gases emitted per kilogram of food. Almost all the low-impact foods on the right are plant-based foods, while all the high-impact foods on the left are animal-based foods, with beef being the worst offender. According to the World Resource Institute, beef-related greenhouse gases are created through agricultural production processes. The cow's digestion and burping, known as enteric fermentation, produce substantial amounts of the greenhouse gas methane. Another potent greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, is present in chemical fertilizers and cow excrement, which pollute local water resources from runoff. Additionally, rising global populations mean an increase in demand for beef, which means more conversion of forest and woodlands, which soak up CO2, destroying precious habitat and converting it into farmland. Similar impacts are felt in the ocean, where shrimp farming is becoming more prevalent. Mangroves like these retain massive amounts of CO2 and act as the ocean's nurseries, providing juvenile sea creatures refuge from larger predators. But mangroves are often cleared away to make room for shrimp farms like these. Whether the farming is on land or in the sea, it also introduces chemicals like pesticides and antibiotics. Runoff that includes these chemicals can affect other unintended species. And according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, a UN agency, agriculture accounts for 70% of global freshwater usage. In fact, climate itself is a destabilizing factor in food production and food security, according to NASA's Goddard Institute, which is a leader in climate change research.
New NASA research suggests that with high greenhouse gas emissions, we'll see declines in global crop yields for maize, corn, as early as 2030. Shifting rainfall patterns, higher temperatures, and increased atmospheric carbon levels are likely to affect where and how much of staple crops like corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice can be grown.
NASA says even with changes in greenhouse gas emissions, some changes to our food ecosystems are unavoidable, a group of crises that are interconnected and self-perpetuating, according to the UN Environment Program. I'm Andrew Falzone for Sustainability Matters on CUNY TV.
Today, I have the pleasure to introduce our guests who are working to implement sustainable alternatives. Ina McPherson, a dedicated gardener, she pioneered Tranquility Farm in Brooklyn, advocating for local food growth and sharing her expertise with the community. Craig Willingham, managing director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute, spearheads efforts to address food-related health disparities. And Jack Algiere, Chief Agroecology Officer at Stone Barn Center, brings a wealth of experience in sustainable agriculture and a passion for regenerative farming practices. And Neeti Jain, a strategic partnership advisor from the Mayor's Office of Food Policy, is shaping the future of the food landscape through innovative partnerships and initiatives. Welcome, guys. Thanks for being here. So, how can we promote resilience? How can we make sure that we can withstand environmental shocks as they come our way?
Sure, I can start. So I think resilience is really thinking about continuity amidst that disruption. So in New York City, at the Mayor's Office of Food Policy, we really want to understand where our food is coming from. We want to make sure that the food that we're producing in the region is something that will be part of a resilient food system. We want to make sure that we have a lot of different suppliers in case one is experiencing a shock or disruption to the system. And then we also want to invest in sustainable practices for those food systems. So, for example, New York City has invested over the years over $400 million in making sure that our watershed practices follow best management practices and really incorporate ways of taking care of our waterways that will lead us to good outcomes in the long term.
From a policy perspective, there are some aspects of this as well. How is the CUNY Institute thinking about this?
Sure, I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind. I think encouraging through various government mechanisms, whether it be subsidies, incentives of other types that support crop diversification, making sure to provide producers with the educational tools and the resources to implement climate-friendly food production practices, more resilient food production practices, and also using public dollars to support producers that ensure that we're shortening supply chains and we're reducing our carbon footprint.
Well, I would add to that by just saying the food system is for everyone. And as a farmer, I think it's really valuable for all of us to recognize that we're all contributors to our food system, that we're not just recipients of something, that actually, when we feel like contributors, we change the way we interface with it. And when that happens, I can grow more diversity. I can improve my relationship and access to land as a farmer. And I know that my friends and co-farmers around the Northeast here rely on that kind of changing demand.
Absolutely. And so community gardens certainly can play a big role in this, and many of us in urban centers maybe don't think about the opportunity to connect and to be able to support food sovereignty, if you will. How do community gardens play a role here?
Well, there are two issues. There's food sovereignty and then there's food justice. You know, sovereignty, you own the rights and you really participate on a higher level. On the other side, there's food justice, which is about access. And access should be for everyone, you know. It's not a privilege to have access to good food. It's just a right. It's a human right. So the opportunity is there in a community garden for everybody to participate, and you don't have to come in with huge skill set. You can learn.
Absolutely. So thinking about community gardening and thinking about soils, I know that you've been at Stone Barns for 20 years, right? As long as they've been around. How do you think about biodiversity and soil health, and how do you integrate that into the work that you're doing at Stone Barns?
The relationship to soil and biodiversity, the complexity we have now is getting out of these monocultural mindsets and these very narrow ways of thinking about how conservation is over here and recreation is over here and food production is over here, rather than finding the ways for these things to mix and interact on their land together. We are farming across about 500 acres of state park preserve, and that expansion for us to get on that greater acreage allowed us to start to do restoration work that includes agricultural patterns, grains, mixed animals. We look at all the plants and animals that we're working with have different kind of superpowers or services that they offer to the landscape that can be coordinated and sequenced in a way that actually improves habitat. So We actually do a lot of monitoring and ecological transects and deep soil carbon and water quality testing and all these different things that are happening there, not so much to guide us, but to verify our work. And all those things actually back to eating. Those patterns of what we call lay rotation, course rotations, where we're mixing animals and vegetables and that sort of thing, actually create the new cuisine. In fact, that's what cuisine is. It's our sustainable creative process and our relationship to the lands.
Walk me through how that plays out.
Well, of course, ruminant animals, cattle, let's just say cows and sheep, they eat grass, they digest that grass, and they actually turn that grass into carbon. For our sake, it's not just about raising these animals, but raising them in their right habitat, eating grass solely and running them through these meadows, these mixed pastures. Over many years, 5 years or so, those pastures get to be enriched by that, and they kind of reach this stable condition. And then we can go into those fields, and we, through a series of cover crops and then grains and legumes and vegetables, we can actually draw that fertility off, produce wonderful food, no fertility added other than those animals that have built that space. And then each crop does a different thing, draws off phosphorus, which is good for the water quality, creates deep rooting, which is good for the carbon sequestration, and then it goes back into an improved pasture system. It sounds really wonderful, but it does take a lot of attention and practice. And in order for that to happen, we need to be encouraging it. We all need to be continually encouraging it. And that happens by the way we eat and the way we create policy so that everybody can eat well.
How can we, what are the policies that we can create? How can we support making this happen?
Having sustainability and resilience in all policies, not just in food, not just in building infrastructure, not just in transportation, making sure that it's part of the policy planning process. Additionally, when it comes to food, making sure that there's infrastructure there, whether that be distribution hubs, whether that be reinforcement of existing transportations and adding to that, whether that be any sort of mechanisms that's used to identify vendors that are doing business with the city, making sure that that infrastructure is there that encourages sustainability and resilience, not one that just looks at the lowest responsible bidder and getting products at the cheapest prices. And lastly, I'll just say, making sure that any sort of changes bring food workers along and that they're supported and that they are recognized as an important part of being resilient overall. We all saw during the pandemic how important food workers became. They essentially got press ganged into being frontline workers because without them, none of us would have been able to eat. And I think we have to acknowledge that when we talk about sustainability and resilience.
Is there a formalized plan that the mayor has put forward to help make all of this happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Mayor's Office of Food Policy has Food Forward New York City, which is very much like a detailed look at our food operations and how we want to think about procurement, distribution. I think some really exciting things coming out of Food Forward is understanding the overlap of food and climate. So we're not just thinking about access and distribution, but we're also thinking about the long-term impacts of the food that we grow, purchase, and then distribute. So as part of Food Forward, we're really trying to understand how we can shift towards climate-friendly and low-carbon diets, and really trying to use things like our city agencies' food procurement, what we're serving in the public schools, what we're serving in the hospitals, what we're serving, leveraging the activity of the private sector as well, to make sure that the choices that we're making about what goes on the plate also has a positive impact on our planet. We want to make sure that our food is a source of medicine and providing ways to fight chronic disease or to really invest in the long-term health of New Yorkers.
Craig, are there any tools or is there any information out there that folks can look to try to understand some of the work that you're doing and some of your findings in this regard?
Well, I think New York City is great in that there is a lot of information that's shared through public mechanisms, particularly NYC data, food metrics report that comes out annually. We've put together a dashboard that looks at the overlap between food security, food access, and health. And I would say there's not just one tool, there are many. I think we could do a better job at aggregating those tools and making the information more easily communicated to the public. I think in terms of efforts like Food Forward, public awareness campaigns would go a long way towards getting community buy-in and making sure that people understand both the goals of the city and the successes that it's had. Moreover, I think sharing success stories is an important part of making sure that the policy efforts that come out of something like Food Forward will be maintained through successive administrations. And I also think that transparency in reporting, transparency in documentation in terms of what's happening at a policy level, at an administrative level when it comes to food, and the city's efforts to meet their promise when it comes to resiliency and sustainability.
It seems like so much of this is about making sure that people understand, whether it is about what they're eating or about what the impact is in terms of what they've decided to purchase. What are some of the educational tools that you're using at Stone Barn to help bring people into this fold and make sure that they understand that what they eat has an impact?
Yeah, the fact is that it's a daunting task and a huge need for change that's happening. Of course, we rarely set up patterns from that kind of fear. We actually make new habits through pleasure. So finding ways to really enjoy this is the way that we develop our programming. All the projects, botanical beverages and these ideas of like cooking, harvest to cook, cooking classes that really engage you are great. Farmers and cooks are working together all the time to create. And so the programming that we produce is that we'll bring people around. Anyone who eats at that space gets out onto the farm and actually engages. It literally tastes better when we understand the goodness that it may be coming from, the good that it may be doing. And for that matter, maybe break a habit when we realize that where that's coming from may not be as wonderful as we thought it was tasting.
Absolutely.
Education, when people come on the site, not formal education, but just interaction. When kids come to the site, or even adults, to see the wonder in children that do not know what a natural fruit or vegetable looks like. Yeah. I've had kids to the garden. We have a fig tree that's abundant. And we have tours with the children, and they come through and they said, would you like a fig? And they said, oh, we don't know. I said, yeah, we've had fig Newton. I said, that's a totally different thing. They're not able to identify a broccoli or, cabbage. Nothing better for me than when the kids come to the garden and you show them the magic of what happens. You show them the compost pile and they see the worms and, oh my God. It's the best thing. And yes, it's interactive to bring adults into the garden and show them and introduce to them the magic of horticulture.
Absolutely. I want to pivot for a second and just talk a little bit about what each one of us can do. How can we each get involved? How can consumers get involved in creating a sustainable food ecosystem?
You could say something like, we should go to our local farmers markets, or maybe we should eat at home more, or sit around the table when we can. Those things are really true. But more importantly, that we can keep it up, that we can maintain that cycle. Because that's the thing that it's the perennial wheel that needs to keep turning in order for us to actually have practice and create habit. Find the patterns that are replicable. Maybe that's that market each week that you just visit and bring a little bit of the same amount of money each week or something, and just use it there instead of the grocery store, if you can, and eat at home and try to make some choices like that. Often if you go too far, you spend a little bit too much, and then you don't do that for weeks or months. And that doesn't really help the farmers, doesn't really help the systems change.
Little steps that are replicable.
So there are a number of different things that I could say, but as a policy researcher, and from that perspective, and also from a personal perspective, I don't embrace the framework of what individuals could do. I think it plays into this way of thinking that we've internalized around personal responsibility and putting it on the individual. I think that the problems that we face in the food system are far more upstream than that. And I think we need to take a broad policy level approach, a population level approach, to make it so the sorts of things that we want to see, the sorts of changes we want to see are automatic. They're the default. People don't have to track their spending, where they're shopping, what they're buying, and turn it into a project. It should just be something that they can do in the course of living their lives. This is not to say that individuals shouldn't be invested in this sort of change, but I think asking people to focus too heavily on behavioral change and on what the individual can do versus what society, what government, what policy should be doing, I think keeps us on this sort of path where we never quite get to where we want to be, because there's never going to be a critical mass of individuals who are doing enough of this sort of behavioral monitoring that will get the changes that we want to see.
So we need top-down changes.
I wouldn't say top, I would say population level. You know.
Okay.
Top-down sounds a little more authoritarian.
Okay.
So I would disagree a little bit with that trend of thought of putting it on an individual, because we all have a role to play. It's just to ask and make requests, even where we purchase our stuff. We could ask to have better merchandise and, you know, say, listen, you know, this is my corner store I buy here. Is it possible that you could carry XYZ? And you'd be surprised. They will accommodate. It all comes together when we all come together as a critical mass. And then we can really affect change. So you could start, and instead of top down, you could start at the bottom and work your way up. So I think there's so many choices that any individual could do. But, you know, a simple thing as compost. Mm.
So, but I would say, I'll give you an example that relates to that. Mm. The city of New York, by making composting mandatory in certain neighborhoods, has done more with a stroke of a pen than people trying to do behavior change over decades. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean by policy level. Mm-hmm. Look at how quickly we were able to get thousands of people, tens of thousands of people to compost just by we have a compost bin on our counter, as does everyone in our building, and they pick up composting from, the city picks up composting there. And from a sort of personal perspective, I want the individual to be able to come together. I want us to be able to come together as a community and not have to depend so much on government, but I also realize the power of government to make things happen in a much more expedient fashion and to bring along people who aren't engaged.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a collaborative effort, and it takes individual, then community, and then you get a critical mass. Mm. But yeah, it all works together. Yeah. But yeah, we can't just rely, because we're really the government. I think we're more powerful than government.
Should be moving it. We
should
be moving it.
Moving it, absolutely.
Yeah. So
coming from the mayor's office.
Well, I think I'll just echo what the two of you have said already, which is the idea that, you know, we need individuals, of course, but we also need change at the systems level and at the policy level. I think your example with the composting being rolled out across all boroughs by the end of 2024 to be mandatory is a great example of how something that started at the grassroots level and was something that was really something that came up through the city of, you know, the residents, is now something that is kind of rolled out across. And the idea of making it easy and making it something that people don't have to, you know, necessarily think a lot about is a great sort of creation of good choice architecture. Like when we think about how our policies can enable good choices for our consumers and for individuals, I think that is sort of the special sauce of making more resilient and sustainable food systems.
So what's next? What do you see in the future? Craig, what do you think?
Well, I'll just say first that we've come a long way in New York City from a food policy perspective. I mean, just from the Bloomberg administration through de Blasio up through Mayor Adams, it's been a revolution in terms of food policy, and many of the policies that were established here in New York starting in the early 2000s have been replicated all over the world. So we've definitely come a long way. With respect to what's next, I don't know. I mean, I think that the challenges that we face are very serious and daunting, and I'm not sure there's the sense of urgency that should be in place in order to truly address those challenges, we're still sort of nibbling around the edges. And I'm not sure, what the solution to changing that approach is. My hope is that we continue to see a sort of positive trajectory, but I just don't see the level of urgency that we need to have. And that makes it difficult for me to know what to say is going to come next.
Interesting. I'm a big believer in project-based change. And I think that's exactly what you're doing. You're showing us what can be done if you think holistically. So, do you think that's working, and what do you see as happening next?
Well, to Craig's point there, that we really do need to make some bold choices. The amount of cooperation that's needed requires us to have hope here. We really do have to have that. And there needs to be boldness in those choices, particularly around the fairness and the justice of this thing, because we're representing practically the entire cross-section of the planet in New York. I mean, it's such an extraordinary place. And to your point that we have set a lot, because of the size, the population of what we are, we've set a pace for many places, and at the same time are far behind other great cities around the world to really learn from. So I think we owe it to our community and the region and the land to make some bold choices, and to, not just incrementally, but transformatively.
Well, I want to thank all of you for what you're doing and the commitment that you've made and the many years of work that you've all put into helping to get us to where we are today. And thank you for coming here and sharing all of this with everyone. And I hope to see you all again here soon. Please keep the conversation going and follow us or send us a message on social media. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us next month when we explore effective ways to minimize waste and create a more sustainable environment.